Catholics venerate the Pope because the Mormon prophet, as his title suggests, has the ability to communicate directly with God and impart new rules from God to the public, just as Joseph Smith did with his golden plates 200 years ago. If you visit the homes of Mormon families, they will often have a picture of the prophet on display somewhere. And when I was in Salt Lake City recently, I went to a Mormon bookstore, and you can see they were selling all sorts of photos of the prophet and his various pals. Mormons tend to always refer to their prophet as President so-and-so.
In representing Jesus Christ as his modern-day prophet, President Russell M. Nelson.
Our beloved prophet, President Russell M. Nelson.
We give thanks for President Nelson and
how righteous President Nelson is.
We will strengthen our glorious President Nelson.
With this fixation on the title of president, almost certainly a remnant of Joseph Smith's desire to become President of the United States someday, though these days Mormons are very fixated on the title of president in general, and a surprising number of people in the lesser hierarchy are called president too. The Mormon prophet has 12 apostles, just like Jesus Christ, although unlike Jesus, they carry over from one prophet to another, often serving for many decades. The longest serving apostle of all serves as the chairman of what they call the Quorum of the 12, and when the prophet dies, he becomes the new prophet. What this means in practice is that the Mormon prophets tend to be extremely old. The current prophet, President Russell M. Nelson, recently turned 100, and the guy who is next in line is 92. This in turn helps explain why the Mormon Church is so famously conservative. Its leaders are by definition always several generations behind in the times. At the present rate, it will be a while before the Mormons even have a prophet born after World War II, for instance. So when I was in Salt Lake, I bought this charming little set of posters of all of the different Mormon prophets. I think they're supposed to be like for a Mormon classroom or something. And you can see that each one is illustrated with a little montage around the prophet's face, showing the various things that he was known for. So let us now go through them, and I will tell you what you're supposed to know about each guy. In studying these prophets, I have relied on both Mormon and non-Mormon sources. The LDS Church produces a lot of authorized history about the prophets that is very detailed, but obviously biased, while a lot of ex-Mormon or non-Mormon sources are less detailed but more objective or critical. I put some of my sources in the description if you are craving more than just a superficial overview, but my goal for this video is to just try to explain the gist of these men, their relevance to the LDS Church, the Mormon religion, and in some cases, America itself. So Joseph Smith was killed in 1844 by an angry mob who had invaded the jail cell where he was being held in Carthage, Illinois. You can learn about how he got there from somebody else's video. But in any case, after his murder, the Mormons needed to pick someone else to lead their church, which by then had about 20,000 followers in the American Midwest, and the person they settled on was Brigham Young, a carpenter from rural New York who had risen to become Joseph Smith's right-hand man. Apparently, things were settled when, during a debate over who should be the next church leader, Brigham Young gave a passionate speech where he literally transformed into Joseph Smith himself.
Brigham Young, who was the president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, arose to speak when the mantle of Joseph fell upon him, and he was like one transformed. His countenance, voice, and form were like those of the late prophet. Many in the congregation, even children, saw this miracle. It satisfied the people and decided the question, who was to be the leader?
After Joseph Smith, Brigham Young is probably the Mormon prophet that the greatest number of non-Mormons have heard of, as you can see from the covered wagons in this picture here. He is best known for leading the early Mormons on a long trek out of the Midwest, which had become very anti-Mormon, and into the Utah desert, which in those days was still part of Mexico. Settling his followers in this unpopulated area, Brigham Young proclaimed himself governor of the state of Deseret, and he served for the next 30 years as a competent and effective architect of a thriving new American colony based around a new city known as Salt Lake. In 1848, America annexed Utah from Mexico, and Brigham Young applied to get his colony whose borders he defined a little generously, admitted to the United States. The Congress whittled it way down and said it could only be a territory, the territory of Utah, though in a significant concession, the federal government agreed to recognize Young as the legal governor. Now, in his later years, Joseph Smith had told his inner circle that God wanted them to become polygamists. And knowing it would be controversial, this doctrine of plural marriage was initially a closely guarded secret of the Mormon elite, who nevertheless embraced it with gusto. Joseph Smith would take 34 wives, while Brigham Young would take, by some estimates, 57. In 1852, however, Brigham Young went public and announced to the world that God wanted Mormons to be polygamists. No longer an awkward secret, polygamy quickly became an open and even proud part of Mormon identity, which in turn quickly made the LDS Church hugely unpopular with the rest of the country. These days, most Americans think of polygamy as kind of ridiculous and maybe a little creepy, but in the 1850s, when sexual norms were extremely uptight, polygamy was considered almost impossibly perverted and repulsive. The idea of a man openly having so many sexual partners was sickening, as was the age gap between some of the Mormon men and their young wives. Many moral crusaders of the time actually considered polygamy as offensive to the natural order as slavery, and often spoke of it in the same breath. And because of this, the notion of a bizarre Mormon theocracy emerging in Utah became increasingly frightening to many Americans. Since the Mormon religion was seen as so grotesque, the idea of this church running a sizable chunk of the United States was seen as deeply offensive to the proper American constitutional system of secular government. President James Buchanan was particularly offended, and he spent a considerable portion of his first State of the Union denouncing Brigham Young as a despicable tyrant who had established absolute power over both church and state in his corner of the continent. And this led to what is sometimes called the Utah War, or the Mormon War. Though no shots were actually fired, Buchanan simply dispatched thousands of troops to the Utah border and threatened to invade. And in early 1858, Brigham Young agreed to step down as governor. A non-Mormon governor was installed, and the U.S. Army set up a giant fort just outside of Salt Lake City, which lasted into the Civil War years. On that note, the other big thing about Brigham Young that has to be mentioned, because next to the polygamy, it would prove to be the single biggest issue for the church, was his incredible racism. Even by the standards of his time, Young had very hateful and violent opinions about black people, believing them to be unfit to be anything beyond slaves or servants. As governor, he legalized slavery in Utah, and as Mormon president, he introduced a policy declaring that black people, or indeed anyone with black ancestry, was unfit to hold office in the LDS Church hierarchy, serve as a missionary, or enter a Mormon temple. African Americans could join the church, but could not enjoy the full benefits of membership, such as having their marriages receive a temple blessing, which is a very important thing in Mormon theology. Brigham Young died in 1877, having served as Mormon prophet for almost 3 decades. He is very much the founding father of Mormon Utah, and in that sense is one of the most unique and consequential figures in the history of the United States, arguably even more so than Joseph Smith himself. The third prophet was a guy named John Taylor, the only foreign-born prophet. He was from England and emigrated to Canada in his 20s, where he was converted by an early Mormon missionary. He moved to the US and became an apostle of Joseph Smith and later Brigham Young, eventually becoming chairman of the Quorum of the 12. And since this was the position that Brigham Young had held when Joseph Smith had died, it was agreed that so too should Taylor become the new prophet now that Brigham Young was dead. And thus has been Mormon tradition ever since. So with slavery having been abolished by the Civil War, America's progressive reformers now turned their attention to polygamy, and this once again made Utah public enemy number 1 in the eyes of Washington, D.C. Congress began passing harsher and harsher anti-polygamy laws, many of which targeted Utah specifically. It culminated in an 1887 bill that outright dissolved the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints as a legal entity and allowed the federal government to seize its assets. Senior Mormon leaders